I can't do this anymore, Claire. I just can't. The words hung in the air of my Sacramento office like a death sentence. My mother's voice, usually so carefully controlled during our bi-weekly phone calls, cracked with exhaustion I'd never heard before. Outside my window, the California sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and red, but all I could see was the darkness in Barbara's voice. Mom, what's happened? Is it Grandma Rose again? A long pause. The kind that tells you everything is about to change. In the silence, I could hear the distant sound of traffic on Highway 50, the familiar hum of my air conditioning, the ticking of the antique clock my ex-husband had never bothered to claim when he left 10 years ago. Normal sounds of a normal Tuesday evening that was about to become anything but normal. She fell yesterday. Third time this month. And Tommy. Tommy was supposed to be watching her, but he was. Another pause, longer this time. He'd been drinking, Claire. In the middle of the day. When I got there from work, she was on the bathroom floor, and he was passed out on the couch. I set down my pen, the policy report I'd been reviewing suddenly meaningless. The pages of California's new healthcare initiative, something I'd been passionate about just moments before, now seemed like artifacts from another person's life. At 53, I'd built a life of careful distances. From my ex-husband's chaos, from family drama, from anything that could derail the stability I'd fought so hard to create after my divorce. But some calls you can't ignore, no matter how high your walls. Where is she now? Did you take her to the hospital? At home. She refuses to go to the hospital. Says she's fine. But Claire, she's not fine. None of us are fine. Your father's been working double shift since the factory cut his hours again. They're talking about more layoffs. I'm picking up extra shifts at the hospital whenever I can, and Tommy. Her voice broke completely now, the sound of a woman who'd been holding everything together for too long. I don't know what to do about Tommy anymore. The admission hung between us across 3,000 miles of telephone wire and 10 years of carefully maintained distance. My mother, who had managed our household through Dad's periodic unemployment, who had nursed Tommy through childhood pneumonia and a dozen other crises, who had somehow kept our family functioning through economic downturns and personal disasters, this woman was telling me she was out of options. Flashback, the divorce that changed everything. 10 years ago, I had been Mrs. Claire Patterson, married to David Patterson, a successful real estate agent with a charming smile and a talent for making me feel like I was the center of his universe. We'd lived in a beautiful house in suburban San Jose, complete with a manicured lawn and a two-car garage. I believed in the fairy tale so completely that I'd never thought to question why I didn't have access to our investment accounts, why David handled all the finances, why I was kept in the dark about so many aspects of our supposedly shared life. The day I discovered he'd emptied our joint accounts and moved in with his secretary, a 25-year-old named Brittany, who posted selfies with my husband on social media while I was at my grandmother's funeral, I learned several important lessons all at once. I learned that trust without verification is just stupidity dressed up in pretty clothes. I learned that financial dependence is a cage that looks like love until someone locks the door. And I learned that sometimes the people who promise to protect you are the ones you most need protection from. The divorce had been swift and brutal. David kept the house, the investments, and most of our mutual friends. I kept my dignity, my maiden name, and a burning determination never to be that vulnerable again. Within 6 months, I'd moved to Sacramento and started my consulting business. Within 2 years, I was financially independent. Within 5 years, I was successful enough to buy my own house, maintain my own investments, and sleep soundly knowing that no one could pull the rug out from under me again. But success had come with its own price. I'd become an expert at emotional compartmentalization, at building walls that kept out potential hurt along with potential love. I scheduled my life like a business, maintained relationships at arm's length, and convinced myself that independence was the same thing as happiness. Present the decision, Mom. I'm coming home. The words surprised me as much as they surprised her. 3 hours ago, I'd been reviewing California's new healthcare policy initiatives, planning a presentation for next week's client meeting, living the carefully controlled life I'd built brick by brick after David's betrayal. Now I was booking a red-eye flight to Pennsylvania. Claire, you don't have to do that. We'll figure something out. Tommy promised he'd get his act together, and your father thinks maybe if we just, Mom, stop. I'm coming home. This conversation is over. The firmness in my own voice surprised me. When had I become the kind of person who made declarations instead of requests? When had I learned to cut through the endless cycle of enabling and excuse making that had defined my family for as long as I could remember? As I packed my suitcase, my mind raced through logistics. I'd need to reschedule 3 client meetings, find someone to water my plants, figure out how long I'd be gone. My assistant would have to handle the Henderson Industries presentation, and I'd need to delegate the policy review to my junior associate. The practical concerns felt manageable, familiar territory for someone who'd built a career on solving problems. But underneath the practical concerns was something else: guilt. The kind that sits in your chest like a stone, growing heavier with each month you tell yourself everything is fine from a distance. How long had I been pretending that my bi-weekly phone calls and monthly checks were enough? How long had I been using my success as an excuse to avoid the messy reality of family obligation? Flashback: Tommy's childhood crisis. I was 15 when Tommy almost died. He was 8 years old, a bright, energetic kid who loved baseball and building elaborate Lego structures that took over the entire living room. Then came the pneumonia, not just the ordinary kind that responds to antibiotics and rest, but the severe, life-threatening kind that lands children in intensive care units while their families pray and bargain with God. I remember sitting in the hospital waiting room with Dad while Mom maintained her vigil beside Tommy's bed. The doctors spoke in careful, professional tones about respiratory distress and complications, but their eyes told a different story. They weren't sure he was going to make it. For 2 weeks, our family lived in that hospital. Dad slept in his chair when he slept at all, surviving on vending machine coffee and the sandwiches church ladies brought by. Mom never left Tommy's side, talking to him constantly even when he was unconscious, reading him stories and singing lullabies in a voice hoarse from exhaustion and fear. I shuttled between the hospital and home, keeping the house running and the bills paid, calling relatives with updates, and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly fragile. At 15, I learned that sometimes children die, that families can be destroyed by circumstances beyond their control, and that the phrase, "everything happens for a reason," is what people say when they can't bear to acknowledge that sometimes terrible things just happen. When Tommy finally turned the corner and began to recover, the relief was overwhelming. But something fundamental had changed in our family dynamic. Mom couldn't bear to let him out of her sight. Every cough sent her into a panic. Every scraped knee required immediate medical attention. Every challenge he faced became something she needed to solve for him. Dad tried to intervene, suggesting that maybe Tommy needed to learn some independence, but Mom would shut him down with reminders of how close they'd come to losing him. "He needs us," she'd say, and the unspoken addition was clear. "He needs us because he almost died, because he's fragile, because we can't risk losing him again." She was right that he needed them. She was wrong about everything else. Arrival: the shock of reality. The taxi dropped me off at 6:30 a.m., and the house that had once been the pride of Maple Street looked like it was surrendering to entropy. Dad's carefully maintained garden was overgrown with weeds and volunteer trees. The shutters needed paint, 3 newspapers lay scattered on the front walkway, and someone had left a bag of garbage on the porch where it had been torn open by animals. The key still worked, the same one Grandma Rose had given me when I was 12, for emergencies, she'd said with a wink. And for when you need a quiet place to think. The irony of that memory wasn't lost on me as I stepped into what could only be described as chaos. Empty beer bottles lined the coffee table in the living room, some still containing inches of flat, stale beer. Takeout containers covered the kitchen counter, some recent enough to still smell of grease and others old enough to have developed fuzzy patches of mold. The television was on, volume low, playing an infomercial for some miracle cleaning product that promised to restore surfaces to their original beauty. The smell hit me next: a combination of stale alcohol, old food, unwashed clothes, and something else I couldn't quite identify, but that made my stomach turn. This wasn't the house where I'd grown up. The house where Grandma Rose had taught me to bake chocolate chip cookies and where family dinners had been sacred rituals of connection and conversation. "Claire? What the hell are you doing here?" Tommy appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing yesterday's clothes and squinting against the morning light filtering through dirty windows. At 32, he looked older than I did, his face puffy and his eyes bloodshot. He'd been handsome once. I remembered the shy, sweet boy who'd recovered from pneumonia and grown into a teenager who made girls giggle and parents worry. But that boy was gone, replaced by this hollow-eyed man who seemed to be aging in dog years. Where's Grandma Rose? Still sleeping. Jesus, what time is it? 7 a.m. The fact that this seemed early to him told me everything I needed to know. Grandma Rose had been getting up at 5 every morning for 70 years, first to prepare for her teaching duties and later out of pure habit. She'd make coffee, read the newspaper, and tend to her small indoor garden before the rest of the world stirred. The fact that she was still in bed at 7 a.m. sent ice through my veins. Is she sick? Did something happen after the fall? Tommy rubbed his eyes, trying to focus. She's fine. Just tired. Old people sleep more, you know? But I did know, and that wasn't it. Grandma Rose slept exactly 7 hours per night and had for as long as I could remember. She claimed it was the secret to her longevity, along with daily walks and refusing to hold grudges. If she was still sleeping at 7 a.m., something was very wrong. The discovery Grandma Rose's reality. I found her in her bedroom, sitting in her favorite chair by the window, still wearing the same flower print dress she'd had on in the photo Mom had texted me 3 days ago. Her usually neat room was cluttered with unwashed dishes, unopened mail, and clothes that needed to be laundered. The medication organizer that she'd used religiously for the past 5 years sat empty on the nightstand, and her blood glucose monitor was nowhere to be seen. Grandma? She looked up, and for a moment, her eyes were completely clear, the sharp blue eyes that had intimidated countless third graders over her 30-year teaching career. Claire, my beautiful Claire. You came home. Of course I did. How are you feeling? Mom said you had a fall yesterday. She touched a bruise on her arm, already turning yellow at the edges. The bruise was larger than what you'd expect from a simple fall, and there were older marks on her wrists that looked suspiciously like fingerprints. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just clumsy. Getting old isn't for the weak, you know. But she wasn't fine, and we both knew it. Her skin had the papery quality that comes with dehydration. Her hair, usually styled in the careful waves she'd maintained since the 1960s, was greasy and unkempt. Most concerning of all, she seemed smaller somehow, as if she was disappearing a little bit each day. Grandma, when did you last take your medication? Tommy takes care of all that now. He's such a good boy, Claire. He stays here with me, so I'm not alone. After your grandfather died. Her voice trailed off, and for a moment, she looked confused. Where is William? Wasn't he just here? Grandpa William had been dead for 3 years. I began a systematic search of her room, looking for the pills she needed to manage her diabetes and blood pressure. What I found instead was a horror story told in small details. Prescription bottles with dates from 2 months ago, medical appointment cards for visits that had been missed, and bank statements that showed a pattern of withdrawals that made no sense for an elderly woman who rarely left the house. Flashback of Grandma Rose's wisdom during my divorce. When I was going through my divorce 10 years ago, I'd come home broken and bitter. David had emptied our joint account, moved in with his secretary, and had the audacity to suggest that our marriage had been dead for years, and that he was just finally being honest about it. I'd spent 3 weeks on Grandma Rose's couch, eating her chocolate chip cookies and wallowing in self-pity. Claire, honey, she'd said one morning, settling beside me with her coffee and the newspaper she still insisted on reading in print. Being hurt is natural. Being stupid about it is a choice. I trusted him, Grandma. I believed every lie he told me. How could I have been so blind? Because you loved him, and love makes us vulnerable. That says something beautiful about your heart. But now you know better. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? She'd helped me see that David's betrayal was about his character, not mine. That I could choose to let it define me or use it to build something stronger. She'd been the one to suggest I move to California, to start fresh somewhere that didn't contain memories of my failed marriage on every street corner. Sometimes, she'd said, the best thing you can do for yourself is start over somewhere nobody knows your story. That way, you get to write a new one. Within 6 months, I'd moved to California and started my consulting business. Within 5 years, I was financially independent for the first time in my life. But now, looking at her in this cluttered bedroom, wearing the same clothes she'd had on for days, I realized I'd learned the wrong lesson. I'd built walls so high that even the people who deserved my trust couldn't reach me. The investigation, following the money trail, while Tommy slept off his hangover and my parents were at work, I spread Grandma Rose's financial documents across the kitchen table and began to piece together the story they told. What I found made my stomach turn and my hands shake with rage. Grandma Rose's savings account, which should have contained roughly $47,000 from Grandpa William's life insurance and their accumulated retirement savings, had been steadily drained over the past 8 months. The balance was now less than $3,000. Cash withdrawals of $200 and $300 appeared twice a week, sometimes more. There were charges at liquor stores she'd never visited, gas stations she'd never been to, and something called Lucky 7 Gaming that a quick internet search revealed to be an online gambling site. Her checking account told an even worse story. The monthly Social Security and pension deposits that should have covered her modest living expenses were being systematically redirected. Automatic withdrawals that she'd never authorized. Credit card charges for Xbox games, DoorDash orders, and bar tabs at places whose names I didn't recognize. Most damning of all were the prescription records. Her diabetes medication hadn't been filled in 3 weeks because someone had been trying to use her insurance card at multiple pharmacies, triggering fraud alerts that had frozen her coverage. Her blood pressure medication was a month overdue, and her doctor's office had been calling repeatedly about missed appointments. I found the receipts in a showbox under Tommy's bed. Casino chips, lottery tickets, bar tabs that sometimes exceeded $200 for a single night, and gaming charges that painted a picture of someone completely out of control. There were pawn shop receipts too for jewelry that I recognized as pieces Grandpa William had given Grandma Rose for their anniversaries. The pattern was clear, methodical, and absolutely sickening. This wasn't the impulsive spending of someone who'd lost control. This was the systematic exploitation of a vulnerable elderly woman by someone she trusted completely. Flashback Tommy's pattern of rescue. The signs had been there for years, but we'd all chosen to ignore them or make excuses. In high school, Tommy had been caught stealing money from Mom's purse to buy lunch because he'd spent his lunch money on baseball cards. Mom had blamed herself for not giving him enough allowance. In college, he'd racked up credit card debt and called home in tears, claiming he'd been stupid about money and promising it would never happen again. Dad had paid off the cards and set up a budget that Tommy had ignored within a month. After college, there had been a series of jobs that never lasted more than a few months. Tommy always had explanations: unfair bosses, jealous coworkers, companies that didn't appreciate his talents. Mom and Dad always had solutions: help with rent, assistance with job searches, unconditional support while he figured things out. When he'd moved in with Grandma Rose 2 years ago, ostensibly to help her after Grandpa William's death, we'd all thought it was a sign of maturity. Tommy was finally taking responsibility, caring for someone other than himself. Mom had been so proud, telling everyone about her son who was sacrificing his independence to care for his grandmother. We'd all been so desperate to believe in his redemption that we'd ignored the obvious questions. Why wasn't Grandma Rose getting better care if Tommy was there full time? Why did she seem more confused and frail every time we saw her? Why were there always new expenses and financial emergencies whenever anyone asked about her welfare? The answer was staring at me from these financial records. Tommy hadn't moved in to care for Grandma Rose. He'd moved in to milk her dry. Confrontation around one. When Tommy finally stumbled downstairs around noon, I was sitting at the kitchen table with 6 months of bank statements spread in front of me like evidence at a trial. He looked terrible, unshaven, unwashed, and carrying the particular kind of shakiness that comes from needing a drink. Jesus, Claire, what's all this mess? Grandma Rose's financial records. I thought you might want to explain some of these withdrawals. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally a kind of trapped panic that would have been almost funny if the situation weren't so serious. I don't know what you're talking about. $400 at Rivers Casino last Tuesday. $350 at the Brass Monkey on Friday. $600 in cash withdrawals last week alone. I pointed to each highlighted transaction with the kind of precision I usually reserve for client presentations. Grandma Rose doesn't gamble, Tommy. She doesn't even drink wine with dinner anymore. I was. She asked me to. To what? Steal from her while she goes without her medication? Use her credit card to fund your gambling addiction while she sits upstairs in clothes she's been wearing for 3 days? It's not stealing. She lives here. I take care of her. I deserve some compensation for. Compensation? I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the linoleum floor. What exactly are you being compensated for? Letting her fall in the bathroom while you're passed out drunk? Failing to fill her prescriptions while you spend her money on lottery tickets? You don't know anything. He was shouting now, his face red with anger and shame. You ran off to California with your fancy job and your perfect life, and you left us here to deal with everything. I send money every month, Tommy. $500 every month for the past 2 years. Money that was supposed to help with Grandma's care. Where did that money go? The silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of his heavy breathing and the drip of the kitchen faucet that Dad had been meaning to fix for months. In that silence, I could see him calculating, trying to figure out which lie might still work, which excuse might still save him. But we were past the point of lies and excuses. The evidence was spread across the table in black and white, and for the first time in his life, Tommy was going to have to face consequences without someone rushing in to rescue him. The phone calls building a support network. While Tommy retreated to his room to think about things, I began making the phone calls that would start to build a solution. The first was to Patricia Williams, a social worker who specialized in elder care. I'd found her through a recommendation from my company's employee assistance program, and she agreed to come to the house the following day. The second call was to Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, Grandma Rose's primary care physician. The conversation was both illuminating and heartbreaking. I've been trying to reach Rose for months, Dr. Morgan explained. She's missed her last 4 appointments, and when I've called the house, her grandson tells me she's doing fine and doesn't need to be seen. What about her prescriptions? That's been a problem too. Someone's been trying to fill them at multiple pharmacies, which triggered our fraud prevention protocols. When I tried to call and clarify, I was told that Rose was managing her medication just fine and didn't need any help. The third call was to Grandma Rose's bank. After navigating through several departments and explaining the situation multiple times, I was transferred to their Elder Abuse Prevention Unit, a department I hadn't even known existed. Ma'am, the representative explained, what you're describing fits a pattern we see frequently. Financial exploitation of elderly family members is unfortunately common, and it often goes unreported because the victims are either too confused to understand what's happening or too ashamed to admit they're being victimized by someone they love. What can be done about it? Several things. We can freeze the accounts to prevent further unauthorized withdrawals. We can generate a complete transaction history for the past year. And we can refer the case to Adult Protective Services for investigation. Each phone call added another piece to the puzzle of Grandma Rose's deteriorating situation, and each piece made me angrier and more determined to fix what had been broken through years of neglect and enabling. Flashback, the last real family dinner 2 years ago, when Tommy had first moved in with Grandma Rose, we'd all gotten together for what turned out to be our last real family dinner. Mom had made her famous pot roast. Dad had told his stories about the old days at the factory, and Tommy had seemed genuinely happy and optimistic about his new role as Grandma's caretaker. I want to do this right, he'd said, serving Grandma Rose another helping of mashed potatoes. She's done so much for all of us. It's time I gave something back. Grandma Rose had beamed at him, patting his hand and telling him what a good boy he was. Dad had looked proud, and Mom had actually teared up talking about how mature Tommy had become. I felt hopeful too, despite my usual skepticism about Tommy's promises. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe taking care of someone else would finally give him the sense of purpose he'd been lacking. Maybe responsibility would mature him in ways that consequences never had. But even then, there had been warning signs I'd chosen to ignore. Tommy had asked to borrow $50 before dessert, claiming he needed gas money to take Grandma Rose to the doctor the next day. When I'd offered to pay for the gas directly, he'd gotten defensive and changed the subject. Grandma Rose had seemed unusually tired, going to bed before 8 p.m. when she usually stayed up to watch the evening news. Looking back, I could see that the exploitation had probably started immediately. Tommy had simply been more careful about it in the beginning, taking smaller amounts and covering his tracks better. But as his addictions progressed and his desperation grew, he'd become sloppy. And Grandma Rose, dealing with the early stages of dementia and the grief of losing her husband, had been too vulnerable to protect herself. The family conference, Truth and Consequences. That evening, when Mom and Dad came home from their respective jobs, I called a family meeting. We sat around the same kitchen table where we'd eaten countless dinners, but the atmosphere was anything but nostalgic. The evidence of Tommy's financial abuse was still spread across the table, and the weight of what it represented hung over all of us like a storm cloud. I've spent the day reviewing Grandma Rose's situation, I began, keeping my voice steady and professional despite the anger burning in my chest. We need to talk about some serious problems. Dad looked exhausted, his factory uniform still dirty from his shift. His hands, once strong and steady from years of skilled labor, showed the tremor that had developed since his last layoff. Mom had changed out of her hospital scrubs but still carried the perpetual tension of someone who worked too many hours for too little pay. Tommy slouched in his chair, alternating between defiance and shame. Claire, honey, Mom started, her voice already taking on the defensive tone I remembered from my childhood whenever anyone criticized Tommy. I know things look bad, but we're managing. Tommy's been such a help. And, Mom, stop. I spread the bank statements across the table with the systematic precision of someone presenting evidence. This isn't managing. This is financial abuse. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Which, I realized, they were. That's a hell of a thing to say about your own brother, Dad said quietly. But his eyes were already moving across the bank statements, and I could see the moment when the pattern became clear to him. It's the truth. Tommy has been systematically draining Grandma's accounts while her medication goes unfilled and her bills go unpaid. This isn't about family helping family. This is theft, and it's been going on for months. Mom's face had gone pale. Tommy, is this true? Tommy's composure cracked completely. Tears started streaming down his face, and for a moment, he looked like the 8-year-old boy who'd almost died of pneumonia instead of the 32-year-old man who'd been stealing from his grandmother. I never meant for it to get this bad, he whispered. I was going to pay it back when I got back on my feet. I was going to win it back at the casino and put everything right. When exactly was that going to happen? I asked, keeping my voice level despite the fury building inside me. When you sobered up, when you stopped gambling, when you got a job that lasted more than 3 weeks? Claire, that's enough, Mom said sharply, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Is it enough, Mom? Is it enough that he's stolen nearly $50,000 from an elderly woman with dementia? Is it enough that her blood pressure is dangerously high because she can't get her medication? Is it enough that she's been sitting upstairs in dirty clothes because he's too drunk to help her shower? The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and Tommy's quiet sobbing. I looked at my family, really looked at them for the first time in years. Mom's hands were shaking with exhaustion and stress. Dad's shoulders were hunched with the weight of problems he didn't know how to solve. Tommy was falling apart right there at the table. And suddenly, I wasn't just angry anymore. I was heartbroken. Flashback, the intervention that never happened 5 years ago, when Tommy had been arrested for his second DUI, I'd flown home and proposed that we stage an intervention. I'd researched treatment facilities, found a counselor who specialized in addiction, and prepared a comprehensive plan for getting Tommy the help he needed. He's not that bad off, Mom had protested. He just made some poor choices. He doesn't need some expensive treatment center. He was drunk at 2 in the afternoon, Mom. He crashed his car into a school zone sign. What if there had been children around? But there weren't, Dad had said, as if Tommy's luck somehow negated the danger he'd posed. He's learned his lesson. Sometimes people need to hit bottom before they can climb back up. This isn't bottom yet. Mom had looked at me with the kind of disappointment usually reserved for children who'd failed to understand something obvious. Family doesn't give up on family, Claire. We stick together and work through problems. We don't ship people off to institutions because they're going through a rough patch. So instead of an intervention, there had been another rescue. Dad had hired a lawyer to minimize the charges. Mom had taken time off work to drive Tommy to court appearances and community service obligations. I'd written a check to cover the fines and the increased insurance premiums. And Tommy had learned exactly the lesson we taught him. No matter how badly he screwed up, someone would always be there to clean up the mess. The professional perspective, Patricia Williams arrived the next morning with a thick folder and a manner that managed to be both gentle and absolutely no nonsense. She was probably in her late 50s, with gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that had clearly seen every variation of family dysfunction multiple times. "Mrs. Morrison," she said to my mother after settling into Grandma Rose's living room, "I've reviewed the information Claire provided, and I'm concerned about several serious issues." Mom sat stiffly on the couch, her defensive walls firmly in place. Dad fidgeted with his coffee cup, clearly uncomfortable with having a stranger examine our family's problems. Tommy had disappeared upstairs the moment Patricia arrived, claiming he wasn't feeling well. "First, let's talk about Rose's medical care. When was her last comprehensive health evaluation?" "I'm not sure exactly," Mom admitted. "Tommy usually handles her medical appointments." "And where is Tommy today?" He's not feeling well." Patricia made a note in her folder. "Rose needs immediate medical attention. Her diabetes isn't being properly managed. Her blood pressure medication has been discontinued, and she shows signs of dehydration and possible depression." "We're doing our best," Mom said defensively. "I understand this is difficult, Mrs. Morrison. Family caregiving is one of the most challenging responsibilities anyone can take on. But sometimes our best isn't enough. Sometimes we need to acknowledge that we're in over our heads and ask for professional help." "What are you suggesting?" "Several things. Rose needs to see her doctor immediately for a complete evaluation. She needs her medications restored and properly managed. And she needs a safe living environment where her welfare is the primary concern." The implications hung in the air, unspoken but clear. The current living arrangement wasn't safe. Tommy wasn't a caregiver. He was a liability. The medical assessment, Dr. Morgan agreed to make a house call that afternoon, something she rarely did but felt was necessary given the circumstances. What she found confirmed my worst fears. Grandma Rose's blood pressure was dangerously elevated. Her blood glucose levels were wildly unstable. She was dehydrated, malnourished, and showed signs of medication withdrawal that could have been life-threatening if allowed to continue. "Rose," Dr. Morgan said gently, sitting beside her on the bed, "when did you last take your heart medication?" Grandma Rose looked confused, glancing toward the empty pill organizer on her nightstand. "Tommy gives me my pills every morning with breakfast." "What did you have for breakfast today?" I don't remember." "Was I supposed to have breakfast?" Dr. Morgan caught my eye and shook her head slightly. We stepped into the hallway for a private conversation. "Claire, I need to be direct with you. Your grandmother's condition is serious. The medication interruptions could have caused a stroke or heart attack. The dehydration has likely contributed to her confusion and disorientation. And frankly, she shows signs of depression that suggest she's aware, on some level, that she's not being properly cared for." "What needs to happen now?" "Immediately. She needs to be hospitalized for stabilization. Her medications need to be restored gradually and under medical supervision. Once she's stable, she needs to be in an environment where her care is properly managed." "You mean she can't stay here?" "Not under the current circumstances, no. I'm sorry, but I have to recommend that she be placed in a facility that can provide the level of care she needs." Flashback Grandma Rose's teaching philosophy. When I was in high school and struggling with calculus, Grandma Rose had offered to tutor me. She'd been retired for several years by then, but she still maintained the organized approach that had made her one of the most respected teachers in the district. "The key to solving any problem," she'd explain, "is breaking it down into manageable pieces. Don't look at the whole equation and get overwhelmed. Take it step by step, solve each piece, and trust that the solution will emerge." We'd spent hours at her kitchen table, working through problems that had seemed impossible until she showed me how to approach them systematically. She'd been endlessly patient, explaining concepts in different ways until something clicked, celebrating small victories and treating mistakes as learning opportunities. Claire, she'd said one evening after I'd finally mastered a particularly difficult concept, you have a good mind for solving problems. Don't ever let anyone convince you that you're not smart enough to figure things out. Sometimes the answer isn't obvious right away, but if you keep working at it and don't give up, the solution will come. Now, sitting in her bedroom while Dr. Morgan explained her medical needs, I could hear her voice from all those years ago. This was just another problem that needed to be broken down into manageable pieces. Take it step by step. Solve each piece. Trust that the solution will emerge. The hospital admission, convincing Grandma Rose to go to the hospital was harder than I'd expected. She'd become suspicious of medical professionals over the past months, probably because Tommy had been intercepting calls and messages from her doctor's office. I don't need to go to the hospital, she insisted, clutching my hand with surprising strength. Tommy takes good care of me. I just need to rest. Grandma, you haven't been taking your medication. That's why you feel so tired and confused. I take my pills every day. Tommy brings them to me with my coffee. I gently showed her the empty pill organizer. When did you last see Tommy give you pills? She stared at the organizer for a long moment, and I could see her trying to remember, trying to make sense of days that had blurred together in a haze of neglect and confusion. I, I don't remember, she finally admitted, and the confusion in her voice broke my heart. The ambulance arrived quietly, without sirens, and the paramedics were gentle and professional as they helped Grandma Rose onto the stretcher. She held my hand during the entire ride to the hospital, occasionally asking where we were going and why, her short-term memory already compromised by the medication withdrawal and dehydration. At the hospital, the emergency room staff moved with efficient urgency. 4 fluids, blood tests, cardiac monitoring, all the interventions that should have happened weeks ago. I sat beside her bed, holding her hand and watching her face relax as proper hydration and medication began to restore some clarity to her thinking. Claire? She said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been in days. Are we at the hospital? Yes, Grandma. Dr. Morgan wanted to make sure you're okay. She was quiet for a moment, processing this information. How long have I been sick? It was such a simple question, but the answer was so complicated. How do you tell someone that they've been slowly poisoned by neglect? That their own grandson has been stealing from them while they deteriorated? That their family has been in denial about the extent of their vulnerability? You haven't been taking your medication properly, I said carefully. That's why you've been feeling confused and tired. Tommy was supposed to. She stopped, and I could see her mind working, trying to piece together memories that didn't quite fit. Claire, I think I need help. Real help. The confrontation around 2. When I returned to the house that evening, I found Tommy in the kitchen, drinking beer and looking belligerent. The hospital discharge papers and medication schedule I'd received were spread on the counter, and he'd clearly been reading them. So you had her committed, he said without looking up. I had her hospitalized because her blood pressure was stroke level and she was severely dehydrated. Because someone hasn't been giving her medication for weeks. I gave her pills every morning. What pills, Tommy? Her prescriptions ran out a month ago, and you never refilled them. He was quiet for a moment, trapped by the simple facts of the situation. I meant to. I kept meaning to, but the pharmacy was being difficult about the insurance, and I had to work. And you don't work, Tommy. You haven't held a job for more than a few weeks in 2 years. That's not true. Prove it. Show me pay stubs. Show me an employment contract. Show me anything that demonstrates you've been doing something other than stealing from Grandma Rose and lying to the rest of us. He couldn't, of course, because there was nothing to show. You know what your problem is, Claire? His voice was getting louder, more aggressive. You think you're so much better than the rest of us. You think your money and your fancy job make you special. My money? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Tommy, I've been sending $500 a month to help with Grandma's care. Where did that money go? It went to her care. Food, utilities, keeping this house running. Show me the receipts. Show me the grocery bills, the utility payments, the house maintenance. Show me anything that proves you spent my money on Grandma Rose instead of on gambling and alcohol. Again, silence. Because there were no receipts. There was no accounting. There was just a long pattern of taking money meant for an elderly woman's care and spending it on his own addictions. Flashback, the promises that were never kept. There had been so many promises over the years. Tommy promising to get sober after his first DUI. Tommy promising to find steady work after dropping out of college. Tommy promising to pay back the money he'd borrowed from Dad's retirement fund. Tommy promising to take better care of himself, his responsibilities, his relationships. Each promise had been delivered with such sincerity, such apparent commitment to change, that we'd all wanted to believe it was true. And when the promises were inevitably broken, there was always an explanation that made the failure seem like a temporary setback rather than part of a larger pattern. The job ended because the boss was unreasonable. The sobriety lapsed because of stress. The money disappeared because of unexpected expenses. There was always a reason that made the failure seem understandable, forgivable, and definitely not Tommy's fault. But this time was different. This time, the victim of his broken promises wasn't just himself or even our parents. This time, he'd been stealing from a vulnerable elderly woman who trusted him completely. This time, his mistakes could have killed someone. The difficult decisions. The next morning, I met with Patricia Williams, Dr. Morgan, and a representative from Adult Protective Services to discuss Grandma Rose's options. The conversation took place in a sterile conference room at the hospital, with fluorescent lights humming overhead and the distant sounds of medical equipment beeping in other rooms. Rose can't return to her current living situation, Dr. Morgan said without preamble. The medical neglect she's experienced puts her at serious risk for future complications. The Adult Protective Services representative, a soft-spoken woman named Janet Rodriguez, consulted her notes. We're opening a formal investigation into the financial exploitation. The bank records you provided show a clear pattern of unauthorized transactions totaling nearly $50,000 over the past 18 months. What does that mean for Tommy? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. That depends on several factors. Whether your grandmother wants to press charges, whether the district attorney decides to prosecute, whether Tommy cooperates with the investigation and shows genuine commitment to treatment. Patricia leaned forward. For now, our primary concern needs to be Rose's immediate welfare. She needs a safe place to live with appropriate medical supervision and social support. We discussed several options: assisted living facilities, in-home care, temporary placement with other family members. Each option had advantages and drawbacks, costs and complications. But one thing was clear. Grandma Rose couldn't go home as long as Tommy was there. The visit, honest conversations. Later that afternoon, I sat beside Grandma Rose's hospital bed while she picked at a lunch tray. The medications had restored much of her mental clarity, and she was more alert than I'd seen her in months. Claire, I need to ask you something, she said, setting down her fork and looking at me with those sharp blue eyes. How bad is it? The money situation, I mean. There was no point in lying to her. She taught me that honesty, even when it hurt, was always better than comfortable deception. It's bad, Grandma. Most of your savings are gone. Tommy has been using your accounts to fund his gambling and drinking. She nodded as if this confirmed something she suspected. I thought so. There were days when I couldn't remember if I'd given him permission to use my bank card, but something felt wrong about it. You're not responsible for this. You trusted someone you loved, and he betrayed that trust. I know. She was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the parking lot below. Claire, I want you to know that I don't blame you for living your own life. You worked hard to build something good for yourself, and I'm proud of you for that. I should have visited more often. I should have paid closer attention to what was happening. Maybe. But you can't save people who don't want to be saved. And you can't sacrifice your own happiness to enable someone else's self-destruction. Her words hit me like a physical blow. How had she managed to see so clearly what the rest of us had refused to acknowledge? What do you want to happen now? I asked. She was quiet for a long time, and I could see her weighing her options, considering the impact of her decisions on everyone involved. I want to live somewhere safe, she said finally. Somewhere I can remember your grandfather's face without worrying about whether my medication will be there tomorrow. And I want Tommy to get help. Real help, not just another chance to disappoint everyone again. The family reckoning. That evening, I gathered my parents and Tommy in the hospital's family conference room for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of our lives. Tommy looked terrible, shaky, pale, and clearly struggling with withdrawal symptoms. Mom had been crying, and Dad looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 3 days. The doctors say Grandma Rose can be discharged in a few days, I began. But she can't go home. Not under the current circumstances. Where will she go? Mom asked. There are several assisted living facilities that specialize in memory care. Places where she can have her own apartment but with professional medical support available 24 hours a day. Those places are expensive, Dad said quietly. They are. But between her Social Security, her pension, and what's left of her savings, she can afford it. At least for a while. What about Tommy? Mom's voice was barely above a whisper. Tommy has two choices. He can enter a residential treatment program for addiction, or he can find somewhere else to live. But he can't continue to live in Grandma's house. You can't kick me out. Tommy's voice cracked with desperation. That's my home. I've been living there for 2 years. It's not your home, Tommy. It's Grandma Rose's house, and you've been living there rent-free while stealing from her. That ends now. Mom started crying harder. Claire, he's your brother. He's family, and she's our grandmother. She deserves to feel safe and cared for in whatever time she has left. She doesn't deserve to be robbed by her own family. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Mom's quiet sobbing and the hum of the hospital's ventilation system. Finally, Dad spoke. What kind of treatment program? I pulled out the brochures Patricia had given me. There are several options. Inpatient programs that last 30 to 90 days, followed by outpatient support and counseling. Programs that address both the alcohol dependency and the gambling addiction. I don't need treatment, Tommy said, but his voice lacked conviction. You've stolen $50,000 from an elderly woman while she went without medical care. You absolutely need treatment. What if he refuses? Dad asked. Then he finds somewhere else to live, and we let the legal system handle the financial crimes. Adult Protective Services is already investigating, and the district attorney will decide whether to file charges. The weight of that possibility settled over all of us. Tommy could face felony charges for elder abuse and financial exploitation. He could go to prison. Flashback of the grandfather's wisdom. I thought about a conversation I had with Grandpa William shortly before he died. He'd been reflecting on his life, on the choices he'd made, and the lessons he learned. Claire, he'd said, the hardest thing about loving someone is knowing when to stop rescuing them. Your grandmother and I, we made mistakes with your parents' generation. We fixed too many problems, prevented too many consequences. We thought we were being kind, but we were really just preventing them from learning to be strong. What do you mean? Sometimes love means letting people fall. It means watching them struggle and not rushing in to save them. Because if you never let them fall, they never learn to pick themselves up. He'd been talking about Dad's struggles with unemployment, about the pattern of family bailouts and rescues that had become generational. But his words applied just as much to Tommy's situation. How do you know when to help and when to step back? When your help is making them weaker instead of stronger. When your rescue becomes their excuse not to try. When your love becomes their permission to keep hurting themselves and others. The treatment decision, Tommy agreed to enter treatment, but only after Janet Rodriguez explained the potential criminal charges he faced and Dad made it clear that he wouldn't have their financial or emotional support unless he committed to getting help. The program Patricia recommended was called New Beginnings, and it specialized in treating adults with co-occurring alcohol and gambling addictions. The 90-day residential phase would be followed by 6 months of intensive outpatient support, including financial counseling and job placement assistance. It's not going to be easy, the intake counselor explained during our visit to the facility. Recovery requires complete honesty about the extent of the problem and genuine commitment to change. Many people aren't ready to do that work. What's the success rate? I asked. That depends on how you define success. About 60% of our residents complete the full program. Of those, about 40% maintain sobriety for 2 years or more. The numbers are better for people who have strong family support and genuine motivation to change. Tommy would start the program the following week. In the meantime, he would stay with mom and dad, but under strict conditions: no access to cash or credit cards, no unsupervised time, and daily attendance at AA meetings. Finding Grandma Rose a new home. The assisted living facility we chose for Grandma Rose was called Willowbrook Senior Living, and it felt more like a small apartment complex than an institution. Her unit had a bedroom, a sitting area, and a kitchenette, along with a private bathroom and a small balcony overlooking a garden. I can bring some of my own furniture? She asked as we toured the facility. Absolutely, the director assured her. We want this to feel like home. Many residents bring family photos, favorite chairs, small pieces that have sentimental value. The medical support was comprehensive but unobtrusive. Medication management, daily wellness checks, and emergency response systems, but also independence and dignity. Residents could come and go as they pleased, cook their own meals if they wanted to, and maintain whatever level of autonomy their health allowed. What about visitors? Grandma Rose asked. Anytime, as long as they respect our quiet hours. Family is always welcome. I could see her relaxing as we toured the facility, asking questions about the library, the garden club, and the weekly movie nights. For the first time in months, she seemed hopeful about the future. Moving Grandma Rose out of her house of 40 years was harder than I'd expected. Every room contained decades of memories. Every closet held treasures that seemed too precious to discard but too numerous to keep. We spent 3 days going through her belongings, deciding what could fit in her new apartment and what would need to be stored or given away. She was surprisingly practical about most things, but there were moments when the weight of leaving her life behind became overwhelming. This was William's favorite chair, she said, running her hands over the worn fabric of the recliner where he'd watch television every evening. He sat here to read the newspaper every morning for 20 years. We can take it to your new place if you want. No, it's too big. But maybe. She opened the drawer in the side table and pulled out a small photo album. Maybe just this. Pictures of him in his chair, in this room. That way I can remember. We packed carefully. Her bedroom furniture, her favorite books, the china set she'd inherited from her own grandmother, and dozens of family photos. The rest would be donated or sold, but those decisions could wait until after she was settled. Tommy helped with the packing, though he was clearly struggling with withdrawal symptoms and the weight of his guilt. He was gentle with her belongings, careful with her treasures, and I could see glimpses of the boy he'd been before addiction took hold of his life. I'm sorry, Grandma, he said quietly as we loaded the last box into the moving truck. I'm sorry for everything. She hugged him tightly, this woman who'd been victimized by his addiction but who still loved him unconditionally. I know you are, sweetheart. Now you need to get better, for yourself and for all of us. The new beginning, Grandma Rose's first week at Willowbrook went better than any of us had hoped. She joined the book club, started helping with the facility's garden, and made friends with several other residents. The staff was attentive but respectful, and her medical needs were being properly managed for the first time in months. I visited every day, helping her settle in and adjust to her new routine. We unpacked her belongings together, arranged her furniture, and hung family photos on the walls. Slowly, the apartment began to feel like home. Claire, she said one afternoon as we sat on her balcony watching other residents tend the garden below, I want you to know that you did the right thing. All of it, the hospital, this place, making Tommy face his problems. It couldn't have been easy, but it was right. I keep wondering if there was another way, something that could have kept the family together. Sweetheart, sometimes keeping a family together means making hard choices. Sometimes love means saying no instead of yes, means enforcing boundaries instead of enabling bad behavior. She was right, but it still hurt. The family I'd grown up in, the one where we all pretended Tommy's problems were temporary setbacks instead of serious addictions, was gone. In its place was something messy but potentially healthier, built on honesty instead of enabling. Tommy's progress slow and uncertain. Tommy's first weeks in treatment were rocky. He called home several times, claiming the program was too strict, the counselors were unfair, and the other residents were worse off than he was. Each time, Mom wanted to rescue him, and each time, Dad and I had to remind her that rescue wasn't love. He sounds so sad, she said after one particularly difficult phone call. Maybe we should visit, bring him some home-cooked food, let him know we still love him. Mom, the program specifically says no family visits for the first month. They need time to break down his patterns of manipulation and excuse making. Manipulation? That's a terrible thing to say about your own brother. But it wasn't terrible if it was true. Tommy had been manipulating all of us for years, using our love for him as a weapon against our better judgment. The treatment program was designed to help him develop healthier ways of relating to family and managing his problems. 3 weeks into the program, I received a call from his counselor. Tommy is making progress, she reported, but it's slow. He's beginning to acknowledge the extent of his addiction and the harm it's caused, but he's still resistant to taking full responsibility for his choices. What does that mean practically? He talks about his gambling as something that happened to him rather than something he chose. He describes the theft from your grandmother as a series of mistakes rather than a pattern of exploitation. We're working on helping him see the difference. Flashback, the teaching moment. When I was 16, I'd gotten caught shoplifting a lipstick from the drugstore. It wasn't because I couldn't afford it, I had babysitting money in my wallet. It was because my friends were doing it, and I wanted to fit in with their reckless behavior. Grandma Rose had picked me up from the store after the manager called our house. She'd been quiet during the drive home, but I could feel her disappointment radiating from the driver's seat. Why? She'd asked when we pulled into her driveway. I don't know. Everyone else was doing it. That's not a reason, Claire. That's an excuse. Try again. I tried to explain about peer pressure, about wanting to belong, about how it wasn't really a big deal. But she'd listen patiently and then ask the question that changed everything. Do you think what you did was wrong? Well, yes, but no buts. Do you think it was wrong? Yes. Then why did you do it? The question forced me to confront the uncomfortable truth. I'd done something I knew was wrong because I'd wanted something more than I'd wanted to be good. I'd prioritized fitting in over integrity, belonging over honesty. I wanted the lipstick, and I wanted my friends to think I was brave enough to take it. There. That's the truth. Now we can talk about how to make better choices next time. She'd made me return to the store to apologize to the manager and pay for the lipstick, even though he'd said it wasn't necessary. She'd made me write a letter explaining what I'd learned from the experience. And she'd talked to me about the difference between reasons and excuses, between taking responsibility and deflecting blame. Tommy hadn't learned that lesson yet. But maybe, with professional help and enough time, he could. The gradual healing, 6 weeks after Tommy entered treatment, our family began to find a new rhythm. Mom and Dad were seeing a counselor who specialized in family systems and codependency, learning how to love Tommy without enabling his addiction. I was flying back to Sacramento for work but returning to Pennsylvania every other weekend to check on everyone's progress. Grandma Rose was thriving at Willowbrook. Her memory had improved significantly now that her medications were properly managed, and she'd become something of a leader among the residents. She'd organized a gardening club, started tutoring children from the local elementary school, and had even begun dating a retired widower named Frank who lived down the hall. Don't look so shocked, she told me when I met Frank for the first time. I'm 78, not dead. William wouldn't want me to spend the rest of my life mourning him. Frank was a gentleman who'd taught high school history for 40 years before retiring. He and Grandma Rose spent their evenings playing cards, reading to each other, and sharing stories about their late spouses. It was sweet and age-appropriate and exactly what she needed to feel vital and connected. The family therapy is 2 months into Tommy's treatment. His counselor invited the family to participate in a therapy session designed to address the patterns that had enabled his addiction. We sat in a circle in a comfortable room with soft lighting and boxes of tissues strategically placed around the space. Tommy, the therapist began, tell your family what you've learned about how your addiction affected them. Tommy looked nervous but more alert than I'd seen him in years. The physical transformation was remarkable. He'd gained healthy weight, his skin had cleared up, and his eyes were bright and focused. I learned that my drinking and gambling hurt all of you, not just me. I used Grandma Rose's love for me to steal from her. I used Mom and Dad's worry about me to avoid consequences. And I used Claire's distance to blame her for problems I created. It was a start, but I could hear the carefully rehearsed quality of his words. This was what he'd been taught to say, not necessarily what he believed. How do you feel about that? The therapist prompted. Ashamed. Angry at myself. Scared that I've damaged things so badly that they can't be fixed. That sounded more genuine. Mom started crying. We just want our son back. Our real son, not the person addiction turned him into. Mrs. Morrison, the therapist said gently, what have you learned about your role in enabling Tommy's addiction? Mom's face crumpled. I learned that I was so afraid of losing him that I prevented him from growing up. Every time I rescued him from consequences, I taught him that he didn't have to be responsible for his choices. Dad nodded slowly. We both did that. We loved him so much that we crippled him. The confrontation around 3, toward the end of the session, the therapist asked Tommy to speak directly to each family member about the specific harm his addiction had caused them. Grandma Rose, he began, his voice shaking, I stole from you while you trusted me to take care of you. I let you go without medicine while I spent your money on gambling. I could have killed you with my selfishness. Grandma Rose, who'd insisted on attending the session despite the difficulty of the 90-minute drive, reached over and took his hand. I forgive you, Tommy. But forgiving you doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It means choosing to love you while protecting myself from future harm. Mom, Dad, I used your love for me as a weapon against your judgment. Every time you wanted to set boundaries or enforce consequences, I made you feel guilty for not supporting me. I taught you that love meant never saying no to me. Mom was sobbing now, but she managed to speak. We taught you that too. We're all responsible for the patterns we created. Claire, Tommy turned to me last. I blamed you for abandoning the family when really I was jealous of your success and independence. I resented that you built a good life while I was destroying mine. And I hated that you could see through my excuses when everyone else believed them. I felt tears starting to flow, the first I'd cried since this whole crisis began. I should have intervened sooner. I knew something was wrong, but I convinced myself it wasn't my responsibility. It wasn't. The therapist interjected. You're not responsible for Tommy's choices, and you're not responsible for your parents' enabling behaviors. You're only responsible for your own actions and decisions. The accountability plan, before Tommy could complete the program and return to some version of normal life, we had to create an accountability plan that would protect everyone involved while supporting his recovery. The plan was detailed and non-negotiable. Tommy would live with Mom and Dad for 6 months, paying rent and contributing to household expenses through a part-time job the program would help him find. He would attend AA meetings daily, see his addiction counselor twice a week, and submit to random drug and alcohol testing. He would have no access to credit cards, bank accounts, or cash beyond a small weekly allowance for personal expenses. All major purchases would require approval from his sponsor and his parents. He would make monthly restitution payments to Grandma Rose's account, even if they were small amounts. The payments were less about the money than about accepting responsibility for the harm he'd caused. Most importantly, any violation of these conditions would result in immediate removal from Mom and Dad's house and the end of family financial or emotional support. This sounds harsh, Mom said as we reviewed the plan. It's not harsh, the counselor replied. It's clear. Tommy needs structure and accountability to maintain his recovery. Unclear expectations and flexible boundaries are triggers for relapse. The gradual return, Tommy completed the 90-day residential program and transitioned to intensive outpatient treatment. His first weeks back home were tense and awkward, but gradually, we all began to adjust to the new dynamics. He found a job at a local landscaping company, working 40 hours a week doing physical labor that left him tired but satisfied. The routine was good for him, and his supervisor was a recovering alcoholic who understood the challenges of early sobriety. It's weird, he told me during one of our supervised visits, having to account for every hour and every dollar. but also kind of relief. I don't have to make decisions about whether to gamble or drink because those aren't options anymore. Mom and dad were learning to be supportive without being enabling. They encouraged his recovery, but didn't praise him excessively for doing things that responsible adults should do automatically. They offered love without offering rescue. It's hard, Mom admitted during one of our phone calls. Sometimes I want to give him money for something special, or let him borrow the car without checking with his sponsor first. But I remember what the counselor said about how my kindness contributed to his addiction. The new normal, 6 months later, 6 months after the crisis that had brought me home, our family had settled into patterns that were healthier if less comfortable than before. Grandma Rose was flourishing at Willowbrook, having found a sense of purpose and community she'd been missing since Grandpa William's death. Tommy was maintaining his sobriety and making slow but steady progress in rebuilding trust with the family. I had decided to move my consulting business partially back to Pennsylvania, splitting my time between Sacramento and my hometown. It wasn't because I felt obligated to monitor Tommy's progress or manage family crises, but because I'd realized that my radical independence had been as much about fear as it had been about strength. "You seem different," Grandma Rose observed during one of our weekly lunch dates. "More relaxed, somehow." "I feel different. Less guarded, I guess. Less afraid that caring about people will automatically lead to being taken advantage of." It took courage to come home and deal with all this mess. A lot of people would have just sent money and hoped for the best. Sending money was exactly the wrong thing to do. It just enabled the dysfunction to continue. She smiled, the same wise smile I remembered from childhood. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is the hardest thing. You saved this family by refusing to pretend everything was fine. Epilogue 1 year later. I'm writing this from my home office in Sacramento, but tomorrow I fly back to Pennsylvania for Grandma Rose's 79th birthday party. It will be held in Willowbrook's community room, and the guest list includes her new boyfriend Frank, her friends from the gardening club, and all of us, her real family and her chosen family. Tommy will be there too. He's been sober for 14 months now, longer than any previous attempt. He's still living with mom and dad, but he's saving money for his own apartment and talking about maybe going back to school to study addiction counseling. The restitution payments to Grandma Rose are small but consistent, a monthly reminder of the commitment he's made to accountability. Mom and dad are doing well. Dad is planning to retire next year, confident for the first time that Tommy won't need constant financial support. Mom has learned to express love through encouragement rather than rescue, and she's discovered that she actually enjoys having adult relationships with her children instead of managing their problems. As for me, I've learned the difference between healthy boundaries and defensive walls. I've learned that you can love people without enabling their dysfunction, and that sometimes the most generous thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's self-destruction. My phone rings as I finish packing for tomorrow's flight. For a split second, my heart rate spikes, the conditioned response to family phone calls that might bring crisis. But it's just Grandma Rose, calling to make sure I remembered to bring the photo albums she wanted to show Frank. Of course I remembered, I tell her. "I'll see you tomorrow. I love you, Claire. Thank you for saving us all." We saved each other, Grandma. That's what families do. After I hang up, I sit for a moment in the quiet of my office, thinking about the journey that brought us here. It wasn't the family story I would have chosen, full of addiction and financial abuse and painful confrontations. But it was honest in a way our old story never was. And sometimes honesty, even when it hurts, is the foundation for something better. Outside my window, the California sunset is painting the sky in familiar shades of orange and red. Tomorrow I'll wake up in Pennsylvania, in the house where I grew up, surrounded by family members who've learned to love each other without destroying themselves in the process. Some calls change everything. Others just remind you that love, real love, sometimes requires courage more than comfort. The trick is learning to tell the difference.